and you, midnight and a rendezvous.
I'm the chief drama critic of the Daily Chronicle.
Jimmy Erskine's never liked me.
Hold your breath, for he is theatrical sewage.
It's a disaster. You should talk to him.
Over the last 10 years, you've compared me to livestock, creatures of the sea, and an extinct bird. It's going to stop.
Oh, are you retiring?
Tone it down. More beauty, less beast. We can restore the Chronicle to its rightful place as the most read family newspaper in the country.
Watch your backs.
He won't come up to the old guard. Beyond the paper.
Anyone who threatens the reputation of this newspaper is an undesirable.
You must practice your perversion behind closed doors.
You're a cheeky old queer, ain't you? May I return the compliment?
Mr. Erskine, are you a homosexual?
1 month's notice.
What did you expect?
You must have something on him.
The man's a saint.
All men have secrets. I'll find his.
From your secret admirer.
Look, he's crying.
Viscount Brooke. Powerful, rich, but catastrophically married. I have something delicate to discuss. Do me a little service. I want you to please him, and in return, you will gain my unyielding favor, all that's required to make you a star. Don't let me down.
Or what?
You're so naughty.
You're a maniac with a death wish.
I'm the critic. I have power and influence.
How on earth do you live with yourself?
Please, this is only the beginning.
Greetings. Richard the Film Geek here, and I'm here to give you guys my review of the 2023 British period character drama thriller, The Critic. Obviously not to be confused with the 90s American adult animated sitcom of the same name, which was loosely adapted from the 2015 Anthony Quinn novel Curtain Call by playwright Patrick Marber, who previously wrote the screenplays for Asylum, Closer, and Notes on a Scandal, was co-produced and directed by Anand Tucker, who had previously helmed Hillary and Jackie, and stars national treasure Ian McKellen, aka Magneto from X-Men, and of course Gandalf himself from both the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit trilogies, Gemma Arterton, Mark Strong, Lesley Manville, Romola Garai, Ben Barnes, aka Prince Caspian from the Narnia trilogy, and Alfred Enoch, aka Dean Thomas from the Harry Potter films, as well as the real-life son of the late William Russell, aka Ian Chesterton from Doctor Who. The story of The Critic takes place in mid-1930s London during the rise of fascism in Europe prior to the outbreak of World War II, and we follow an openly gay and flamboyantly powerful yet feared theatre critic for the Daily Chronicle named Jimmy Erskine, played by Ian McKellen, who, upon fearing his position may be under threat from his new boss, Viscount David Brooke, played by Mark Strong, strikes up a Faustian pact with a struggling actress named Nina Land, played by Gemma Arterton, who also turns out to be the very object of his legendarily catty, scathing reviews, and promptly takes matters into his own hands by entangling himself and everyone around him in a dangerously convoluted web of deception, blackmail, betrayal, and murder. So basically, in other words, for all intents and purposes, imagine Anton Ego from Ratatouille, but with a much darker, crueler, sinister edge.
I'd like your heart roasted on a spit.
So now that I've recently watched this movie for the first time, here are my thoughts on the Critic. Well, especially coming from someone who is an online film critic myself, this one seemed more up my street, even though I still wanted to go into this one with an open mind, especially after reading up some of the pretty mixed reviews beforehand. So, actually, as it turns out, count me pretty damn surprised to report that even though I think the film isn't really quite as perfect as it otherwise had the absolute potential to be, and even, of course, despite my acknowledgement that the story can be a bit messy, uneven, and inconsistent at times, especially when it comes to the middle third, as well as the ending, which, by the way, apparently is a much different ending to the one originally shown at TIFF, or the Toronto International Film Festival, back in 2023, before the film's official release date here in the UK, due to drastic reshoots and re-edits on the part of Lionsgate in response to the rather initially mixed audience reception from the festival screening. I still kind of really like this movie. When it comes to the performances, everyone involved, at least for the most part, are on top form here. The two obvious standouts being Gemma Arterton and especially the living British acting legend and cultural icon himself, Ian McKellen. Speaking of Ian McKellen, not only is he the first person you have to talk about when reviewing this movie, but his performance here as the titular critic, Jimmy Erskine, is by far the biggest reason to watch this movie. With every nod, expression in his face, as well as body language, every flicker and flourish of his poison pen, every angle of his hat, and especially every puff of his cigar, the man is clearly having the fantastic time of his life here, and he really relishes the opportunity to play such a delightfully despicable and villainous, yet at the same time emotionally interesting and complex character who could otherwise very easily have fallen into caricature territory. And his scenes with Gemma Arterton perfectly make for some of the most emotionally riveting, engaging, and compelling moments in the entire movie. In fact, the only best way for me to describe Jimmy Erskine's character in this film is he is basically a much darker, less redeemable version of Anton Ego if he then decided to take a leaf from the murder book of Tom Ripley and become a bit of a serial killer in order to conceal from the public the fact that he is gay, especially during a time when homosexuality itself in general was particularly criminalized in this country. Which somehow makes it all the more baffling to me why I didn't really particularly find the middle third, when the blackmail plot starts to kick in by roughly the half-hour mark, and from there kind of devolves into a Downton Abbey or posh EastEnders style soap opera to be quite as interesting or compelling as the first and final thirds, because the film so heavily relies on McKellen's performance to make it work that when his character disappears during that middle third, the film kind of loses a third of the gravity it otherwise instantly has when McKellen does show up on screen. Especially given that I, like a lot of other people, was first introduced to Gemma Arterton either through her debut role as the head girl Kelly Jones in the St. Trinian's films, and or her extended cameo as Strawberry Fields in by far the weakest Daniel Craig Bond film, Quantum of Solace. I'm actually happier for her that she's since moved on in recent years from doing blockbusters like Bond and Prince of Persia in favour of doing smaller, low-budget, independent productions, and thus really providing herself with the opportunity to show us what she's truly capable of as a serious actress, and that she is far more than just a pretty face. And with that being said, likewise with McKellen, Gemma Arterton is the other massive reason to watch this movie. She just absolutely crushes it here as Nina Land, who's this emotionally vulnerable and deeply fragile young woman who is constantly made to feel worthless and down on her luck as a result of Jimmy's regular scathing critiques of her acting skills, even despite her admission to Jimmy during a fantastically acted confrontation between the two of them early on in the film, that she actually looks up to him, that his newspaper reviews are actually what inspired her in the first place to pursue acting, and that meeting whatever expectations he truly has of her are all that she's ever really wanted to feel validated and taken seriously as an actress. And yet it's Nina's exact vulnerability fragility and over-eagerness to please that Jimmy takes full advantage of by reluctantly recruiting her to go through with this rather Machiavellian and sinister blackmail scheme against his boss, and also ultimately proves to be Nina's tragic undoing by the end of the film. Mark Strong does a great job as always in his role as Viscount David Brooke, even though it is kind of strange and unusual to see the guy wearing a toupee in this film instead of rocking his signature bald head look. Same actually goes for a terrific comeback supporting performance from Ben Barnes. Even Alfie Enoch does a great job here as Jimmy's secretary / secret partner, who is basically sort of the Jiminy Cricket and or unsung hero of this movie, and also constantly attempts, really without any real success, to try and indulge Jimmy's better side, only until the end, where he catches a glimpse of the truly horrible, vindictive and destructive man his employer / lover truly is, as well as the full horrific extent of what he does throughout the film. However, the only two performances that I feel were kind of unfortunately wasted here were Lesley Manville, which one can at least probably understand, since apparently she made this film around the time she filmed her larger role as the much older Princess Margaret, alongside her Maleficent co-star Imelda Staunton in the latter two seasons of The Crown, and especially Romola Garai in what is frankly an inexcusably thankless bit role. Anand Tucker, in my opinion, does a superb job here with his direction, as does Patrick Marber with his screenplay adaptation, for the most part. The film also visually looks amazing in 4K. The production design and the costumes are top-notch, and Craig Armstrong's score especially is just brilliant. Actually, before I give my final thoughts here, another thing that doesn't really help the film and instead kind of unfortunately hinders it is the rather odd change in setting from book to film, especially at least both in terms of historical context and when you take into account the fact that the film takes place in 1934 during the rise of fascism in this country prior to the war, and yet the book apparently takes place a couple of years later, with the added historical backdrop of the abdication of King Edward VIII, who himself was widely notoriously known anyway at the time to be a fascist sympathiser, as well as a particular traitorous appeaser to Hitler and the Nazis. And the reason why I find this substantial change from the source material to be rather odd is because by setting the story 2 years earlier without any notable historic event to cohesively provide the backdrop, backdrop, apart from the obvious, of course, you actually end up making the story and the heavy themes it bravely attempts to tackle, such as preservation of legacy, growing nationalism, homophobia/racism, deceit, blackmail, and hidden secrets, kind of disappointingly purposeless. And thus I feel that these themes could have both made much more narrative and cohesive sense, and hit so much more powerfully and palatably if Patrick Marber just left the time period setting as it was and actually retained it from the book. In other words, a classic case of, if it's not broke, don't fix it. In conclusion, despite its relatively few imperfections, and even though I think it's far from a classic, and even though I think it's not going to be for everyone for semi-obvious reasons, at least from a storytelling perspective, I still personally had a real good blast with the Critic. It is handsomely crafted from a technical standpoint, superbly directed and written, once again for the most part, and Arterton and especially McKellen are true highlights and are what make this movie as decently enjoyable and watchable as it is. If you want to see Ian McKellen delightfully chewing up the scenery, this film would be most definitely right up your street. If you're into character and or period dramas, this film might also definitely be right up your street, with only a few reservations. If you're as much into film or any other form of entertainment criticism as I am, this film will be most definitely right up your street as well. Heck, even if you happen to be a diehard fan of McKellen and or Gemma Arterton, and or are curious to want to check this film out for yourself, I would also definitely highly recommend this film to you. Well worth the price of admission. However, if you're looking for a more faithful or straightforward adaptation of the book, then sadly I'm afraid you're not quite really going to find it here. And with all that being said, my overall rating for the Critic is going to be an 8 out of 10.
Your arms held a message tender, saying I surrender all my love to you.
Don't forget to do the following few things as always. Leave a comment below, let me know your thoughts on the Critic, subscribe to my channel, click on the little bell to receive any emailed notifications and or updates from my channel. If you haven't already, you can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Letterboxd. Do take care everyone, and farewell.
Midnight brought us sweet romance. I know all my whole life through I'll be remembering you, whatever else